Hello, welcome to English 160, Introduction to Literature. This lecture will be on literary devices. So, first of all, before we get started, let's discuss why we use literary devices and what are they. Literary devices are essentially techniques writers use to engage their readers beyond the literal meaning of the text. So if you think of it from the perspective of having a conversation in front of someone, you have facial expressions, body language, hand gestures, tone of voice, all of those things that contribute to the meaning of the information. Within a written perspective, though, writers have to use a variety of these devices in order to really carry through the subtextual or hidden meaning or nuances in a statement or a scene. So we're going to start off with the most important one in a sense, and that's setting. This is the time and the place in which the literary piece takes place. It helps establish the mood of the piece. So, for example, would Harry Potter be Harry Potter without Hogwarts, the wizardry school? I know for many young people, those first 3 or 4 books where they go into so much detail about what it's like to be at the school really captivated, especially the details, because it allowed us to build a image in our minds. For those of us who may enjoy the vampire genre, Anne Rice's books, which came out in the 80s and 90s, are set in New Orleans, which is a very old city. It's got a lot of poverty. It has a lot of decay, but it also has a lot of tawdriness. The idea of not just the city falling apart, but also the vibrant life that's in it really informs it. And then finally, London in the late 1800s is where Sherlock Holmes series is set, the original writing that is. And again, there is a lack of very specific modern technology, and it also has that sense of urgency because so much was being invented at the time. Then we move into tone. Tone is the attitude a writer takes towards a subject or character. It can be serious, humorous, sarcastic, ironic, satirical, tongue-in-cheek, solemn, and objective. Basically, when you, as a writer, write about a character or a topic, you have to inform the reader on whether or not this character is a good guy or a bad guy. The boring way is to say, this character's a good guy. Rather, the better way is to demonstrate through their words and actions what kind of person they are. So, in one of the most famous examples of this, Holden Caulfield is the protagonist in J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. And he displays his sarcastic smarts and at times very angry personality through the tone he adopts throughout the novel. So, for example, all morons hate it when you call them a moron. There's just that snide kind of attitude. If a girl looks swell when she meets you, who gives a damn if she's late? Nobody. So again, what we get is this young man who is sexually interested and is not necessarily worried about the nuances of a relationship. And then the last one, I'm the most terrific liar you ever saw in your life. It's awful. If I'm on my way to the store to buy a magazine even, and someone asks me where I'm going, I'm liable to say I'm going to the opera. And again, we get this smart aleck kind of perspective on this character. And ultimately, when you look at the influence of someone like a character such as Holden Caulfield, it is really representative of a particular time in most people's lives where the world just seems a really mixed up, crazy place. So the best way to handle it is with derision and bitterness. Okay, now we're going to move into some of the aspects of writing that are optional in terms of how the author includes or doesn't include. So first we're going to look at alliteration, which is the repetition of the same beginning sound in a sequence. So some examples: Randall rides roller coasters, drowning in debt, a sea of shells, it takes two to tango, naughty but nice, and of course, Fast and Furious. This is one of those things that captures our brain in terms of how it likes to hear words. You know, there's a reason that we like hip-hop and rap because of the wordplay, and this kind of alliteration contributes to the wordplay. It's not rhyme, but it's got the same kind of thing where it makes the reader go, oh, this is a really fun way of stating it. Imagery is descriptive words or phrases that appeal to the five senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. It creates a picture in the reader's mind. So these are all those details that if you allow your brain to absorb them, you can create that picture in your mind. And that picture then gives you a really good ability to imagine the action or the lack of action depending on the kind of book you're reading. Now, this is an example of imagery from a very famous short story called The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell. So, he leapt up upon the rail and balanced himself there to get greater elevation. His pipe, striking a rope, was knocked from his mouth. He lunged for it. A short, hoarse cry came from his lips as he realized he had reached too far and had lost his balance. The cry was pinched off short as the blood-warm waters of the Caribbean Sea closed over his head. He struggled to the surface and tried to cry out, but the wash from the speeding yacht slapped him in the face, and the salt water in his open mouth made him gag. So again, we have qualities of imagery. For example, blood-warm waters. You can kind of feel the nice warm water, as opposed to if you go to the Jersey Shore, for example, it's often very cold, even in the summertime. And then you have this image of a speeding yacht going by and the wake slapping him in the face, almost like an insult, and the salt water making him gag. You have all of these different details that contribute to this very finite, specific picture you get in your mind. Additionally, we have something called a motif or a theme, and it's the reoccurring element in an artistic or literary work. It's ultimately the dominant idea. It is an element of a story that binds together various other parts of a narrative. So, some of the major examples, we have war, we have love, we have the idea of being tempted, succumbing to temptation, and then finding redemption. We have the stories of the hero going on a journey. We have the idea of the ugly duckling growing up to be a beautiful swan. And all of these themes represent a specific idea that the author is demonstrating. Now, one of the most common things that we're going to be talking about in this class are metaphors. It is a figure of speech in which two things are compared, usually by saying one thing is another, or by substituting a more descriptive word for the more common or usual word that would be expected. So, some examples: the world's a stage, and all the people in the world are players. That's the kind of metaphor that Shakespeare liked to use. He was a lion in battle, meaning he wasn't like a little kitten where he just curled up in someone's lap and went to sleep. No, he was a lion. He was ferocious in battle. She is drowning in debt. She's literally over her head in how much money she owes. And then last, a sea of troubles. That's another Shakespearean quote. And again, you have this imagery of this woman or man trying to keep their head above water, and all these troubles are pulling them down. And again, the thing is that's a much more interesting image than just saying he was troubled. Now, the next item is a simile, and it's a figure of speech which two things are compared using the word like or as. It's very similar to a metaphor, but if you see the words like or as, you can pretty much guarantee it's a simile. So some examples: she felt like a wilted flower. The boy charged in the room like a bull. The class is like a three-ring circus, and he eats like a pig. So when we see this, we have to remember it's not literal, and obviously most of us would realize that it's not literal. So when it's not literal, oftentimes you can kind of just jump to the conclusion that it is a metaphor or a simile, depending on the words that are being used. An allusion is a reference to a statement, person, place, event, or thing that is known from literature, history, religion, myth, politics, sports, science, or the arts. So, my example: Amelia didn't like to spend money. She was no Scrooge, but she seldom purchased anything except the bare necessities. And who is Scrooge? Scrooge, most of us know, is the guy from A Christmas Carol who tortured Bob Cratchit by making him work in the cold and blah blah blah. So the point is that there are certain things that we just know because it's part of our culture. Now, there's other writers who like to add in a lot of allusions that require some research and some homework. And again, it's almost like a puzzle where you have to identify the allusions in order to get the true meaning of a poem or a piece of literature. And for people who like puzzles, an author like T.S. Eliot, for example, would be a fantastic poet to pursue because he is the master of allusion. Then we have foreshadowing. It is the use of hints or clues to suggest what will happen later in literature. The function of foreshadowing is to build anticipation in the minds of readers about what might happen next, and thus adding dramatic tension to a story. One of the things that you see a lot is a character coughing usually ends up with the character dying by the end of the movie or the story. Another one that is very popular is when you see a young man and a young woman decide to go off into the woods to have sex in a movie at night. And of course, you know, someone with an axe or a machete or a gun or some other macabre way of killing will absolutely kill them. So again, these are foreshadowing things that have become so inborn in our minds that it doesn't even faze us anymore. We just know that's going to happen. Then we have juxtaposition, which is the instance of placing close together two, usually dissimilar characters, concepts, or actions side by side, specifically for comparison or contrast. Now, obviously, the most famous one would be God and Satan, representing pure good and pure evil. In the book Robinson Crusoe, it's a very interesting example of this because Robinson Crusoe is shipwrecked, and he's a gentleman from England, and he is the very model of a civilized gentleman, and he is barely able to survive living on this deserted island until he meets a native or uncivilized man that he then christens Friday. And Friday is very well versed on how to survive on a desert island. And as such, Robinson Crusoe, the ultimate civilized man, must rely upon an uncivilized savage to survive, which the juxtaposition is just wonderfully ironic and informative. And speaking of irony, irony is the language that conveys a certain idea by saying just the opposite. It is an implied discrepancy between what is said and what is meant. So, for example, the Titanic was promoted as being 100% unsinkable, but in 1912 the ship sank on its maiden voyage. Uh-oh. So, again, once you say something like that, something bad is going to happen. Another example is you beg your parents to let you have a kitten or a puppy, and then you discover you're deathly allergic to them. As a side note, if you are familiar with Alanis Morissette's song, Isn't It Ironic? Essentially everything she discusses in that song is not ironic. It's just bad luck. Now, there are two special kinds of irony. The first kind is called dramatic irony, when an audience perceives something that a character in the literature does not know. So, in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, Romeo finds Juliet in a drugged slumber and assumes she is dead, so he kills himself. And then, of course, Juliet wakes up, discovers her dead boyfriend, and kills herself. So that dramatic irony, the audience is in on it. We know what's going on. And the characters, we watch them play out this little drama. And it has so much more meaning to us because we do know we're in on the secret. Now, the other kind of irony is called situational irony. And it's a discrepancy between the expected result and the actual results. And one of the most common or famous examples of this is in the short story by O. Henry called The Gift of the Magi, where the wife sells her beautiful long hair in order, she sells it to a hairdresser who makes wigs out of it, and the money she gets, she buys her husband a gold chain for his watch. Of course, she doesn't know is the husband sells his watch to buy her a pearl hair clasp for her beautiful long hair that she got cut off. So ultimately, what the story tells us is that if you truly love someone, you're willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. And even when you make the ultimate sacrifice, the most important part of that is the love you have for one another. Aww. Then we move into personification, which is a figure of speech in which things or ideas are given human attributes. Examples include dead leaves dance in the wind, blind justice, winter wrapped her cold fingers around me, and the wind stood up and gave a shout. Now, keep in mind, with personification, we're talking about things or ideas. We're not talking about animals, because that is called anthropomorphism. It gives human characteristics to non-humans, primarily gods or animals. And when we say gods, we represent that with Roman, Greek, Norwegian, Chinese, Japanese, Hindu gods. And it's meant, again, to highlight the human characteristics such as jealousy, hatred, or love. And essentially, if you've ever seen a Disney movie, you have seen anthropomorphism. We have Iago there on the left, who is Jafar's sidekick in Aladdin. Then we have the evil Scar from The Lion King. And, of course, everyone's favorite love story, when you're 6, Lady and the Tramp. Now, another option here is a pun, and this is the use of a word in a way that plays on its different meanings. So, a couple examples. Noticing the bunch of bananas, the hungry gorilla went ape. And, of course, gorilla plays off of the word ape. Another example, I recently spent money on detergent to unclog my kitchen sink. It was money down the drain. So again, the pun being drain and sink, and the dual meanings inherent in there. A paradox is one of the most popular and interesting ways of creating tension in a story. It reveals a kind of truth which at first seems contradictory. So in my examples, the first one, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. That's the first line from A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. And he's referencing the French Revolution. It was the best of times if you were a peasant because you were finally getting a piece of the pie, so to speak. It was not so good if you were one of the aristocrats because you were getting your head chopped off. Second example, be cruel to be kind, from Hamlet by Shakespeare. Sometimes it's more important to be honest, which sometimes appears cruel, but ultimately it's a service to the person. And again, at first it seems contradictory, but it is true. And then lastly, and this is again one of my favorite inscriptions, is someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. And that's C.S. Lewis to his godchild Lucy, to whom he dedicated The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And again, what we have here interpretation-wise is that we tend to think of fairy tales as only for children, and yet the stories, the morals, the tales, the allegories are so important. And you know what the truth really is that those kinds of stories are as beneficial to adults as they are for children. Idioms are phrases or expressions that are usually peculiar to a people from a certain community, culture, or social class. The expressions don't mean exactly what the words say, so they're not to be taken literally. So some examples, and I'm sure you've heard of many of these. It's raining cats and dogs. Let's get our show on the road. I chased my tail all morning. Does the cat have your tongue? And penny for your thoughts. So again, these are idioms that are pretty well known in the United States. Now you might go to another country and the idioms are completely different. It's the same thing if you go from East Coast to West Coast in the United States, or even if you go from, for example, Philadelphia up to Boston. They have different idioms. So you have idioms that are very specific to certain cultures, certain locations, and as such you have to kind of look for things that don't make sense to you. A euphemism is a substitution of an agreeable or less offensive expression in place of one that may offend or suggest something unpleasant to the listener. So some examples: instead of someone dying, they passed away. Instead of illegal immigrant, we call them undocumented workers. Instead of firing someone, we like to say we let them go. Enhanced interrogation methods, that's one that's come up in the last 15 years, and that essentially means we torture a prisoner till they tell us something. And then an adult beverage is oftentimes the alcoholic drink that we don't want our children sipping out of. Mommy juice, as we like to call it. Hyperbole. It's not hyperbole, it's hyperbole. A figure of speech in which exaggeration is used for emphasis or effect. An extravagant statement or figure of speech not intended to be taken literally. So again, this has more of a symbolic meaning. I waited an eternity for summer to get here. He could have slept for a year. The book weighs a ton. And I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. And obviously we know, despite how hungry most people are, they could never eat an entire horse. But the emphasis is that's how hungry this person is. Then we have assonance, which is the repetition of vowel sounds. And again, much like alliteration, it's really a way for the reader to get us to focus in on a particular line or sentence or statement. So some examples: days wane away, everyone becomes a beast at a beach feast. The only other sound is the sweep of feet at the creep of dawn. And again, these kinds of sounds, they're really there to make the reader stop, slow down, pay attention. It's like seeing a purple sign in a sea of black and white signs. It just grabs your attention. Then we have a soliloquy, which is a monologue in which a character expresses his or her thoughts to the audience and does not intend the other characters to hear them. You hear this oftentimes in plays, especially Shakespeare. He's got 4 or 5 soliloquies in every one of his tragedies. The most famous, of course, is when Hamlet does his "to be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take up arms and thus defeat them," and so on and so forth. And basically what he's saying is, do I continue to live this life and avenge my father who was killed by my mother, or do I just kill myself and be done with the whole thing? Lastly, we're going to talk about a concept called doppelganger, and this is something that we see in a lot of fiction that is oriented towards troubled people. This is the ghostly double of another character, especially if it haunts its counterpart. It is often represented by the other side of a person's personality. So in a sense, it's like a carbon copy of the character, but with a different soul. Oftentimes they don't look alike. They're not always lookalikes. And there are some times where it is a lookalike, an evil twin, so to speak. So if you've seen the movie Fight Club, or if you've read the book, which is a fantastic book, Brad Pitt and Edward Norton's characters are essentially a doppelganger of one another. You know, Brad Pitt is the aggressive, masculine, hyper-masculine male, and Edward Norton is the more, not feminine, but modern man who has been raised to believe that debate, discussion, collaboration are the better ways of handling conflict. So that finishes up today's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to text or email me, and I hope you have a terrific day. Bye.